In this video, we're going to look at perceived media bias. In the United States, it's not uncommon for the president to levy accusations of bias against members of the media. Now, this might extend to specific media outlets, individual journalists, or even late-night hosts. The idea being that they are biased, treating them unfairly. Canadian politician Pierre Poilievre uses similar rhetoric in accusing the media of being biased and overtly negative towards him, his party, and his ideas. Is there any merit to these claims? Is the media really biased? Well, to answer that question, there's really two different approaches one can take. We can look at the objective media bias, whether there is something in the content that is actually biased, or a subjective media bias. And that really depends on the audience and how they see things. That relies on the judgment of the content rather than the content itself. We'll look at both in turn. An objective approach to measuring media bias would be to try and analyze content and categorize it. It could be categorized as being left or right, accurate or inaccurate. And the folks at Advantis Media try to do that. They have a media bias chart that relies on a panel reviewing thousands of different data points and stories to try and put them somewhere on this map. Now, there are different approaches to doing it, but the idea remains the same, that you're trying to apply an objective formula to an assessment of media bias. On the other side of that is a more subjective approach to media bias. Ballone, Ross, and Lepper identified something that they call the hostile media effect. And here's what they found. When they showed a news story to two different individuals with different partisan leans. So you might have somebody that we could think of liberal and conservative, or however you want to frame that. But these are two different outlooks, two different ideological or partisan perspectives looking at the same content. When they asked them to rate that content was deemed to be biased against them by both individuals. So people on both sides of a given issue both thought that the same content was unfair and it was biased against them. And so just the pure directionality of it isn't really possible. It's the same content. The same content was deemed as biased against people from opposite sides of the issue. Again, that bias is reflected in the judgment of the content, not the content itself. It's the same piece of content they're both seeing. Each one thinks it's biased against them. Now, Richard Perloff took that a step further and expanded upon that. He says that in his observations, the research has indicated that people go even further than that. They think anything that is below positive, even things that are neutral, objectively framed as neutral news stories, are seen as negative. What exactly does that look like? Well, if you take an individual partisan, you show them three different news stories, give them that exposure, each one being framed slightly differently. You have a positive news story, a neutral one, and a negative one. So the positive will be congenial, it'll be pro-attitudinal, it'll already comport with their ideas. The middle one will be neutral and factual. And then, of course, a negative one that will be counter-attitudinal. What happens is the subjects see the positive news story as being neutral, and the neutral and the negative one as being negative. So in their evaluation, the individual consuming the news thinks that the positive depiction is in fact neutral, and anything below that is negative, even the neutral framing. Now, when you combine these two, Goldman and Muntz looked at something that they call media party parallelism. When you have a media environment that is very similar in alignment to the party system. So, for example, if you have two dominant political parties, maybe a right party and a left party, and the media tends to mirror that with right-leaning outlets and left-leaning outfits, then that creates some problems. What happens is you have less cross-cutting exposure. Individuals are not exposed to different ideas. They tend to see their own positive framed ideas, and they assume everything else out there is negative. Politicians absorb this as well. This extends to politicians who think that their supporters are the ones consuming unbiased content, whereas the opposing supporters are consuming content that is biased. And really that leaves people with a misguided depiction of reality. So just to recap, when you hear complaints about media bias, recognize that there is an objective way of doing that. However, a lot of those are rooted in the judgment of the news, that hostile media effect. People tend to view media as biased unless it affirms their beliefs and confirms their priors. This gets worse when that is reflected in the media ecosystem as well. When the media entities, journalists, tend to fall into that same pattern, that media party parallelism, you don't get as much exposure to countervailing ideas, and it gives people a real misguided perception of reality.